Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give people a few minutes to get logged on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Elise Taylor Arnicuri with the National Governors Association and our Energy Infrastructure and Environment Practice. I want to say thank you for joining our webinar today. We are focused on COVID-19 impacts on energy security. Before we get too far along, I want to talk about some of the resources that NGA has been providing during the pandemic. As some of you know, we have our main NGA coronavirus website with a lot of useful links and memos about what states are doing to respond to the virus. We also have our State Resource Center on Energy Security, which has a link to COVID-19 resources specifically for the energy sector. And that's where you can find two of our memos, the governor guidance on the energy sector during COVID-19, as well as our more recent memo on state actions on utility disconnections, which I will kind of go over the highlights of that memo a little bit later in this presentation. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the agenda for today. We're going to first have opening remarks from Chuck Kozak from the DOE Office of Electricity, and then we're going to move into hearing from some of the people in the industry about the energy industry response to COVID-19, and then we'll open it up to questions from states. You guys can ask any questions that you may have of the panelists, and then we'll open up the floor to kind of have a state discussion on reopening and moratoriums on utility disconnections. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chuck Kozak.
Great, Elise, thank you very much. I really appreciate NGA setting up this important meeting, and also appreciate your members taking the time to listen to Team DOE and others in industry on this really important topic. The first thing I'd like to start off with is this is clearly an unprecedented situation in our nation's history, and so by the time we started to react to it, understanding the magnitude of the pandemic, we recognized right off the bat that we needed to establish a way forward that would ensure that the department could execute what are called its primary mission essential functions. And if you go to the DHS FEMA website, there is a description of what is called the Incident Command System. And this system emanates from, it's a component of the National Incident Management System. And it's a really critical way for a department or agency to set forth a predictive, effective way of processing information and dealing with a crisis under all hazards. It's a standardized approach to the command, control, and coordination of emergency response, and it creates a common hierarchy within which responders from multiple agencies can be effective. As I mentioned, it's critical that we have a command and control system when you're dealing with this kind of a complicated, unprecedented situation. Working very closely with the Department of Homeland Security, working very closely with other departments and agencies, and using really essential pieces, which I'm sure Kate will get into, the Electric Sector Coordinating Council and other important areas that CSER plays such a critical role helping to organize. But this command system, I'm a guy who actually spent most of his career over at the Department of Defense. So the idea of having a command system is not new to me, and having a hierarchy, if you will, is not certainly new to me. But it's interesting because each of these meetings that we would have, and to be very specific, Assistant Secretary for the Office of Electricity, Bruce Walker, is the commander, and I'm his deputy. Every day we meet at 1 o'clock, and we go around the horn, so to speak, to address any intelligence issues. So we talk about any potential cyber intrusions or any other potential adversarial effects that are accompanying the crisis. We go to the operations division to talk about ongoing operations. We go to plans, the planning division, to talk about plans, as well as administration and finance to identify any gaps there and make sure that we're focused on things appropriately. The bottom line up front is that having a hierarchy of this nature, and especially being in the throes of such a complicated and widespread crisis, it addresses a lack of accountability, it addresses poor communication, it addresses disorderly planning, it addresses poor integration of requirements and priorities related to planning, and it creates a common terminology from which operators can work from. And so every day, Bruce, through his great leadership, was giving direction to his respective leadership across the lines, the functional lines I described. And so, as you can imagine, there have been cyber incidents that have occurred, which we discussed in the context of the electric power grid. There were other operational issues that we discussed, planning issues, administrative and finance issues as well. And ultimately, what we focused on is that we have among our power market administrations, and that would be Bonneville Power Administration, Southeastern Power Administration, Southwestern Power Administration, Western Area Power Administration. We discussed the 10 operation centers and the 4 backups required. So had the pandemic become so bad in some of these areas, the worry was that what happens if the shelter-in-place orders that are varied but being executed across the nation affected those operation centers where we have very highly experienced and specialized skill sets. And those operation centers are such a critical and integral part of the effective operation of our electric power grid. Not to mention, obviously, think about our brave healthcare workers and first responders who are already reeling and struggling to deal with the effects of this pandemic and save people's lives. Can you imagine if we had outages affecting hospitals and the effectiveness of our first responders during a crisis like this? And so the idea is that to avoid being in a situation where these highly experienced and specialized critical operators, if you will, were to fall sick, and given the virulent nature of this particular coronavirus, we would isolate and did some planning to potentially shelter in place at our facilities so that we could ensure that we kept that critical workforce healthy and safe, and that we were able to test them, we were able to acquire. These were the challenges that we had, identifying, getting tests to prioritize these workers, getting appropriate PPE to ensure that we keep them safe, ensuring that the financing to have 25 or 24/7 operations was in place, ensuring, again, you don't want to have food coming in or people bringing food in, potential other entities or commodities that could be contaminated by the virus. And so, in effect, isolating them should it become necessary. And so a lot of very deliberate and a lot of very detailed planning that Bruce Walker led very effectively, continues to lead. And I'm going to stop there because I don't want to go over my time, but simply say that, should this virus ebb and flow, rest assured that the Department of Energy has a very, very excellent, detailed plan in place to ensure that our power market administrations can execute their essential functions, and more broadly, the department can execute essential functions to assure energy for the nation, whether it's national security requirements going forward or other essential services in the many sectors that we rely upon every day. And I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. That was super helpful. I think you gave some really good background explaining, how DOE and the PMAs are responding to this. I think that was super helpful. I did want to flag two things for participants. If you have a question, feel free to put that in the question and answer box, or you can also send a private message to one of the hosts a little bit later in the presentation if you have any questions, so that we can make sure your questions get answered. And also wanted to flag, we are recording this to put up on our website for later, just for playback for people that were not able to make it. Now we're going to move on to our discussion about energy response to COVID-19. First, we're going to hear from Kate Marks from the CSER office in the Department of Energy.
Great, thank you, Elise, and hi, everybody. So as Elise mentioned, I'm the Director of Preparedness and Exercises within the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, or what we have termed CSER. CSER has also been very active in COVID-19 response, in addition to our colleagues over in the Office of Electricity. Yet we focus on the external partnerships, so supporting state and local governments as well as the energy sector, both on the electricity and the oil and natural gas front. And so we're looking really at how we can support the sector with any issues that they might face as we transition into this next phase of recovery. So that's really where we're focused right now. And I know you all heard from Deputy Assistant Secretary Nick Anderson, I think last week or 2 weeks ago. So there many of you on that call may have heard kind of what CSER does in the preparedness and response areas. And so I want to focus today a little bit on, again, how we're moving into that recovery phase. But just to kind of baseline with everyone, our energy response organization within headquarters is currently activated. We're providing virtual support to the FEMA National Response Coordination Center, as well as having DOE regional coordinators across all of the FEMA regions. So we also have our emergency support function 12, those regional coordinators I mentioned. They're staying in regular contact with your colleagues at the state level within their designated regions to really help to identify the unmet needs in the energy sector. Back at headquarters in that energy response organization, we're holding regular calls with the energy sector through 2 coordinating councils. So we have our oil and natural gas subsector coordinating council, and we have an electricity subsector coordinating council. You'll hear from representatives from each of those sectors in just a moment. We're also continuing the normal DOE functions of monitoring the energy system and various weather forecasts across the country, and of course cyber threats, as Chuck mentioned earlier. But this issue has kind of been particularly notable over the past several weeks because there have been several severe storms. There've been some earthquakes, one just today, and then these are really affecting portions of the energy sector, and we've had to address those impacts in addition to our response to COVID. And I know you all at the state level are dealing with this as well. So we're trying to put some thought into really making sure that we're supporting the state energy officials, the emergency managers, and your offices in trying to coordinate what that dual response might look like. So I want to just note, there is a regularly released frequently asked questions document that CSER puts out every week on the Coronavirus Hub website for DOE. That's at energy.gov/coronavirus-hub. Those FAQs are coming in from the states, they're coming in from the energy sector, and we're really trying to provide all of the energy sector perspective within those responses that we're providing from across the department, across the interagency, across the federal government, really. So I wanted to just point that out so that you all knew that there was that resource that's kind of coming out on a frequent basis. It is publicly available. You can share that with leadership within your states or across the state functions with energy equities. Really a good go-to document to have access to. So we have been on several calls like this one to share updates with state and local governments and also to hear from you all directly. So we're happy to be here today and talk a little bit more about some of the issues you're dealing with on the moratoria and how the utilities are going to kind of function moving forward. And so I just want to note in some of our outreach on COVID, Secretary Dan Bruyette did distribute 2 letters to all of the governors, one at the end of March and the other about a week and a half ago. He highlighted within those letters the criticality of essential workers in the energy sector and really requested that they be allowed access to areas that have shelter in place or stay-at-home orders. The second letter in particular also encouraged governors to think about the prioritization of the energy sector for things like facial coverings or testing and cleaning supplies. So in addition to this transition to recovery, these are some of the biggest needs we're continuing to hear from the energy sector. And I know that they've been asking your state colleagues for some assistance on that as well. I want to note some of the work that we're doing with our interagency partners. So this would include the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, as well as Health and Human Services. And we're doing that in several ways to support energy critical infrastructure. So I know that you all are probably familiar at this point with the development of the list of critical energy workers that DHS has distributed. There's also been some CDC and other guidance to state and local governments related to the access and prioritization of testing and PPE. I'm sure you've also been apprised of some of the FERC, NERC, DOT, and EPA regulatory relief actions. All of that information, in terms of some of the regulatory relief that's being offered to the energy sector is available in that FAQs document on our website. And I just want to note today, FERC Chairman Chatterjee did direct his staff to plan a technical conference looking at the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on the energy industries that they regulate. So, kind of something to keep an eye on in terms of what that might look like moving forward from the FERC perspective. I want to highlight that our DOE task force, which we stood up under COVID-19, it was established in April to help assist DHS and FEMA with some shipments of supplies out to the energy sector. So we did highlight the need for things like test kits and cloth masks for energy personnel across the energy sector. And we were able to work with FEMA to distribute about 1 million facial coverings directly to the sector, as well as about 4,000 test kits to about 89 companies across the country. So we are working with our DOE regional coordinators and again with your state colleagues in emergency management and the state energy offices, at the EOC to make sure that they have that information in terms of who's receiving those test kits in particular. So with that, I just want to take a moment to express our appreciation for all of the work you all are doing at the state level. I think the level of coordination has, been increasingly helpful. And, the incident management system that Chuck brought up is working. I think that there's going to have to continue to be quite a bit of coordination across the government and the states and with the energy sector just to ensure that we can continue to provide fuels and power across the country. And so, again, we really appreciate the help that you all are providing. And we know that many of you have been working nonstop to support the energy sector within your state. This is obviously an unprecedented scale with this pandemic, and the uncertainty is certainly exceptionally challenging. So I just want to note that, for any help with energy sector unmet needs, you can certainly reach out to your Emergency Support Function 12 coordinators within your state emergency operations center. They are directly linked to our DOE regional coordinators, and the help that we can provide is really working with our agency partners or other federal agency partners to provide support to the energy sector. So thank you again, and Elise, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Perfect. I haven't seen any questions pop up quite yet, so they might be saving questions to the end of this little session. We're going to go ahead and so thank you for those remarks, Kate. We're going to move on to Sam Rosenberg, who's here representing the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, to tell us some about their response.
Thank you, Elise. And I just want to pick up where Kate left off and thank all of you on the line for everything you're doing day in, day out to support the electricity subsector and the utilities out there, as well as to the Department of Energy for their unwavering support as our sector-specific agency in providing support, materials and PPE and access to testing and supporting those efforts as well. So I'm going to talk about the ESCC COVID-19 efforts, specifically our resource guide. And I believe you all may have heard about this in the past, but as a refresher, in late February, the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council recognized that utilities have a need for information and planning considerations for how to respond to COVID-19, and we're better together, meaning all segments of the industry coming together as one to share the considerations that they're thinking about and put it in a resource guide. So we did that, started in late February. The first issue came out in early March. It was about 6 pages. The most recent release, or version 8, came out on Monday and is almost 120 pages. There have been well over 250 plus utility subject matter experts from all corners of the electricity subsector, as well as including partners from the oil and natural gas subsector and federal government counterparts and representatives from Canada have been involved as well. So it's really been a team effort. So the most recent issue of the version of the resource guide that came out on Monday has 2 new sections. The biggest section is focused on responsible reentry and return to the workplace. This specific working group had well over 180 subject matter experts from the utility, from the electricity subsector and the oil and natural gas subsector involved in providing input. And then the other new section was on internal and external communications. So when talking about responsible reentry and return to the workplace, we broke it up really into 5 subsections. The first one, which you all can understand, focuses on engagement with state and local governments, recognizing the phased approach that state and local governments have, and making sure there's communication and dialogue between the utility and the government. And then the second subsection being on enterprise-wide reentry planning. The third, planning considerations for reentry into the office spaces. The fourth being planning considerations for field and construction work. And then last, planning considerations for technology. So I'll go through a little bit now. When we talk about engagement with state and local governments, what we really wanted to ensure, again, was a regular line of communications with government decision makers. And for some utilities, some electric utilities, that means going through a state or regional association, primarily on the public power and cooperative side that exists. It also means to identify and attempt to address any inconsistent guidance on economic restart that may exist between levels of government, but also engage with the state government to focus on emergency management, state, local EOCs to be involved in future disaster planning. And, Chuck talked about early on with the incident command system, utilities regularly stand up the incident command system to respond to incidents, including COVID-19. So that is critical here as well. When talking about enterprise-wide reentry planning, the principles that were developed by our subject matter expert utility representatives were be responsible, be measured, and be flexible. So we wanted to ensure that utilities considered those principles, and when they developed a phased approach to their reentry. So through our efforts benchmarking with all the utility representatives, the stages or phases that we came up with, there were 4. Phase 1 or stage 1 is full restrictions, so stay-at-home orders in place. Phase 2 is limited reentry. Phase 3 was expanded reentry, and then phase 4 would be unrestricted. When talking about planning considerations for reentry to the office spaces, again, we looked at returning employees in stages, or only returning those that need to be in the office. Others can continue to work remotely, and then kind of a last resort, returning all employees at once, but that was not ideal. We encourage utilities to develop site-specific guidance, divide employees into separate teams or zones, conduct pre-return training for employees on new procedures, and communicate frequently with employees. As I mentioned at the beginning, a new section on internal and external communications, but recognizing throughout the responsible reentry return to the workplace process, communications, both internally and externally, is absolutely key in making sure that there's a kind of a unified messaging coming from utility leadership. Additionally, some utilities are looking at health screening and testing practices, and we tremendously appreciate the support of the states and the federal government in helping utilities receive priority access to testing, especially for the mission essential personnel that may need to be sequestered, those that operate the control centers or nerve centers of the grid. Utilities shared best practices with regards to office cleanings and changes to meet COVID-19 requirements, OSHA requirements, et cetera. And then on the field and construction work, so we recognize that most employees did not change and alter the amount of construction work they did. A lot of that is essential work. Where it may have changed was, say, a subdivision was being built, the builder decided to pause, the utility may have paused the need to lay new power lines in that neighborhood, kind of during the height of the pandemic while the builder stopped building. That type of work may have been paused or kind of pushed off or delayed. So what considerations do utilities think about as they go back to that and bringing employees back out into the field? So some of the ideas there were, maintain sanitation and social distancing procedures, standard stuff there. Ensuring any contractors are aware of and abide by health and safety protocols that exist at the utility. Making sure that changes to policies or processes for fieldwork are shared and shared regularly and in a tool or method such as an app or SharePoint that can be accessed by all. And then if an employee needs to travel overnight, consider procedures for kind of cleanliness of the hotel and sharing requirements for that with the hotel. And then technology considerations, that really focused on, okay, so I have my laptop at home, I'm connected to my personal Wi-Fi network, it's not as secure maybe as my corporate network. So we laid out some considerations that IT departments should think about as people bring their computers back into the workplace. And then on internal communications, again, that was identifying new and existing communication channels and providing employees with a means to ask questions and provide specific guidance. So all in all, the resource guide, as I said, came out, the updated resource guide came out this past Monday. It is a great resource and I encourage you to take a look. I will share the link through the chat feature shortly. But Elise, that's all I had and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. That was really helpful. Great summary of what the ESCC has been doing lately of response industry and how they're thinking about reopening. Next, we're going to transition to Lori Trawick, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the American Gas Association, has been leading their response to COVID-19. Lori?
Thank you. And I also want to thank everyone on the phone here, first for reaching out to AGA to participate in this forum, and more broadly, just to thank you for reaching out to AGA throughout this crisis. We all recognize how critical it is for us to work together to identify how best to help ensure natural gas is delivered to there are about 179 million Americans who depend on it for their energy needs. I also want to thank you for so quickly and forcefully recognizing the need to designate natural gas workers as essential and therefore in need of appropriate PPE. And as Sam indicated too, all of the work that we've been doing with DOE and FEMA and DHS and all the other acronyms to help make sure that we are able to continue operations. I think as a result of the rigorous planning and training and experience, natural gas utilities have been and are going to be able to continue to deliver natural gas through the duration of this pandemic and beyond without missing a beat. And just to give you an idea, thus far this year, we've delivered over 10 trillion cubic feet of natural gas to homes and businesses. Of course, natural gas utilities are doing that while working effectively remotely and implementing the needed changes to provide a safe work environment while conducting essential work. Natural gas utilities are well positioned through their incident command systems to address any new issues. And as you know, there are some, and as has been mentioned, some uncharted territories related to this pandemic. So to that end, as you know, there are many issues that are applicable to gas and electric, and then there are a few that are gas specific. To maximize the information exchanged and efficiently identify the workable practices where there are similarities, we are working hand in glove with EEI. As Sam mentioned, we are one of the partners in the Electric Sector Coordinating Council and have had strong representation on all of the efforts there, including this reentry effort that you just heard about from Sam. For those areas that are specific to natural gas, we're engaged in several efforts. Over the past 10 weeks, AGA has held around 70 forums involving our CEOs, our CIOs, our VPOs, our CTOs, and our CHROs, and other operators to exchange practices. We've had about 6,000 if you combine everyone who's participated in one and all of those calls. AGA also leads the Oil and Natural Gas Sector Coordinating Council's development of a responsible recovery compendium. So in addition to the resource guide that you just heard about with Sam, there will also be a compendium that reflects the Oil and Natural Gas Sector Coordinating Council's development, their responsible recovery compendium. That's going to address natural gas utilities, supplemental gas storage segments, as well as upstream, including pipelines all the way to the wellhead. And AGA does run the Downstream Natural Gas Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which allows us to ensure that the utilities have the latest on COVID, as well as all the increased cybersecurity activity risks that you also heard about earlier and that we have unfortunately seen. So as you know, safety and reliability when it comes to natural gas, that's of primary importance. And that means there's essential pipe replacement and leak detection and response activities, some of those requiring utility workers to enter the customer homes. This has required new procedures as well as communications to help ensure the customer and the utility employee are as safe as possible. And of course, utility workers are not going into the homes unless they have to now. To that end, it's been tremendously helpful that PHMSA and state regulators have recognized the need for relief from regulatory requirements, those that don't directly impact safety. So as we move into various stages of reopening businesses and getting back to what we're going to see as the new normal, most important is going to be that we recognize that because of the extensive planning, the gas utilities, they know how best to ensure the continued delivery of natural gas. That may mean continuing to work remotely for many of them. And as we all know, it will look different depending on the region and other conditions. So it's just going to be critically important for the utilities to work with the state regulators to continue maintenance, expansion of service where needed, all with minimum risk to the public, to the employees, to the natural gas customers. So with this approach, we should be confident that throughout this transition and beyond, as long as we continue to work together on the policies, on the approaches, that there's going to be continued safe, reliable, and efficient delivery of natural gas. I want to thank you for this valuable interaction. It's so important for us. I certainly welcome any questions. And with that, Owen.
Perfect, Lori. I think that was perfect. I'd like to go ahead and open the floor up. If states have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you and allow you to ask your question directly, or you can use the question and answer feature as well, or the chat to try and express your questions so you can ask the panelists anything that you might be thinking about energy industry response or what their plans are for reopening. I'll give it just a minute to see if any questions pop up. While we're waiting, I did have one question. Kate, I know you had talked about you guys coordinated with FEMA to get masks out to some utilities that were kind of in some of the most impacted areas. Is there any plans to do another distribution? And for the first distribution, who can states reach out to figure out if one of the utilities in their state were able to get distribution?
Sure. So I'll answer the second question first. If you want to know who was requesting masks in your state from the energy sector, you can reach out to the DOE regional coordinator. And Elise, I can make sure that we provide the list of our regional coordinators after this, just so folks have that in front of them. And you can certainly, feel free to provide that contact information as well. Regarding the future distribution of masks, I know that we tried to push those masks out quickly because there was hope that more masks would come in. There's obviously 15 other critical infrastructure sectors beyond the energy sector. So it may be some time before we see our sector kind of prioritized again. But, we are continuing to keep in touch with FEMA and with HHS. There were some direct cloth masks distributed to the states. And so, there were some requests to maybe prioritize certain industries under that request as well. And I believe most of those went into the emergency management agencies at the state level. So I think that would be a good starting point for, if there are any energy sector requests outstanding, you could certainly put them in touch again with the energy point of contact in the State Emergency Operations Center, who would then be able to connect the energy sector folks to the emergency management arm. So hopefully that helps.
Very helpful, and I'll be sure to share that around after the webinar to all the participants so they can know who to follow up with. Seeing no other questions, we can go ahead and transition to the next part of this webinar, which is really speaking with states about the discussion on reopening and moratoriums on utility disconnections. I wanted to highlight the memo that NGA put out sometime last week about disconnections in states. So far, there are 32 states, and the District of Columbia has some form of moratorium out on utility disconnections. They all vary in terms of time and when they start and stop, but it's something that's kind of been consistent. A lot of them are also in times connected to the emergency stay-at-home order. So if states are beginning to reopen and lift those stay-at-home orders, we're very curious about how states are thinking about whether these disconnections should pick back up, or are your state thinking about kind of continuing that moratorium? And then also kind of along with that, several states have also kind of been thinking down the road, as states have these moratoriums and utilities are not collecting full revenue, how do we track these expenses? We've seen Colorado, Hawaii, Illinois, Nevada, and Wisconsin, their PUCs put out notices to have their utilities start tracking their pandemic spending so that when all of this is over, they can kind of backtrack and figure out exactly what are the expenses that are owed and how that should be handled. Texas went a little bit further, and they actually established a ratepayer-funded tariff to help utilities recover from people not currently able to pay their bills. And so just kind of in light of all of that, I would love to hear from the states what you guys are beginning to think, or how your state is thinking about either moving past these moratoriums or how much longer you think they should continue. So again, you can raise your hand to have us unmute you and speak directly, or put your thoughts into the chat or question and answer feature. While you guys are waiting to do that, we do have some representatives from the trade associations here, and we also had a conversation about some of the things that they have been thinking about in terms of reopening and how their members are thinking about this. I also wanted to give the opportunity for them to kind of say how they're thinking about opening up this conversation. So I guess we'll start with Laura Shepis from the Edison Electric Institute. If she could kind of maybe start with the conversation that they're beginning to have within their organization with their members about what this might look like, noting that for every utility this would be a different solution.
Hey, thank you, Elise, and thanks to the National Governors Association for letting us participate today. We really appreciate the opportunity. As we were talking to get ready for this webinar and this discussion, Elise posed the question of what are the unique business challenges for each segment of the electricity sector. And I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic experience and all of the the work that's gone into partnering with Kate and Chuck and their teams at the Department of Energy, and the work that's come from hundreds of industry volunteers that's poured into the guide document that Sam mentioned. The lesson here has been that our business challenges and our operational challenges in this setting are very much in common across the industry. The format of our business model doesn't really distinguish. We have all come together and found common issues in access to quarantined sites, or how to ensure adequate backup staffing for control centers. We've all worked together to figure out how to solve personal protective equipment issues. And so that common set of issues and really common purpose also is very much in place as we work together to share lessons learned and planning considerations for how to re-enter the workplace and play our role in helping the country re-enter the new normal. So the guide that Sam mentioned in version 8, starting on page 75, presents about 25 pages of really excellent thoughts and planning considerations for how utilities are looking at phasing back up, sending people back into the office as that's appropriate, sending field crews back into somewhat more normal, air quotes around normal, plans for maintenance and construction. So there's a lot of good wisdom in that document. I will say for the investor-owned utility sector, our anecdotal evidence so far is that people are taking this in a very slow and deliberate manner. We are pulse surveying our members, and I think we'll confirm that picture over the next couple of weeks. So I'll let others, Desmarie and Barry, talk about reentry, and then we can entertain some other questions that maybe states have.
Okay. Thanks, Laura, and thanks to Elise and the National Governors Association for having us on the call. I completely agree with what Laura has said. I think while our business models are different, we are working incredibly closely together as an industry, and I don't think that we're approaching reentry any differently. So I don't want to necessarily rehash any of the points that she made or that Sam made in talking about all of the great work that the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council has done. I know, just based on what we're hearing from our members, there are those that are in parts of the country that are further along in the reentry process. And we've been hearing from those on conference calls. And as with all things related to public power, there's a lot of diversity, but we've got members that are being very thoughtful and very deliberate in terms of the planning that they're doing to continue to protect their workers as they start to reopen, also to protect their customers as they make decisions about, whether or not they can open up things like their customer service centers. But they're being very thoughtful and deliberative, and I know that they are relying very heavily on the great work that was done by the ESCC in sort of thinking through the host of issues that need to be addressed as we slowly start coming back to being in the office, and again, to ensuring for those utilities that maybe are in parts of the country where the pandemic is still more of an issue, and where reopening of the economy may still be slow. There's been a lot of thought on that, And I think we're just completely aligned in terms of with the industry as a whole on this. And I know that there have been countless hours spent by many folks thinking through all of these issues. And I know our members greatly appreciate the work that's been done collaboratively, not just with the 3 trade associations, but obviously with our federal government partners who've been very, very helpful throughout all of this. We really just appreciate the ability to work with folks, and for all that federal agencies such as DOE have done and to ensure that we have what we need to keep the lights on and make sure that folks, can work from home, for what could be, at least another month, at least in some parts of the country. So I don't really have any more to add in terms of the reentry piece, but obviously I'm available to answer other questions as they arise if folks have those.
All right, this is Barry Lawson with NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And I do want to thank Elise and the NGA for the invitation today. And I will do my best not to duplicate many of the excellent things that have been said so far. I will start off for the electric cooperatives. One of the biggest concerns at this point is related to the financial well-being of electric cooperatives. So when you couple lower demand or lower usage of electricity with a moratorium or other shut-off limitation policies, and with the increased inability for customers to pay, this is a perfect recipe for some serious financial challenges for the co-ops. The co-ops are not-for-profit organizations, and our customers are our shareholders. They are the owners of the cooperative. And most cooperatives serve a high number of persistent poverty counties. So all of this adds up to customers are responsible for all cooperative costs, but with all of the challenges I just mentioned, this all adds up to a decreased revenue flow, and we are very much seeking assistance from the federal government and our states and localities to help in these areas. With regard to our co-op staff, whether it be office management, line crew, or control room or system operators, we do want to thank very much our federal and state government partners who have done an excellent job in very, very difficult circumstances with helping all of the electric utilities, co-op, muni, investor-owned, and others. And so we very much appreciate their efforts. 2 areas I want to emphasize here is, in order for our staff to be able to continue providing a reliable electricity and for the safety of our staff, there still remains, at least for the cooperatives, a pretty significant shortage of N95 masks. While we very much appreciate the cloth masks that have been provided to our sector, the N95 masks are, of course, a separate supply chain challenge. But our employees that work in power plants and other industrial roles, not to mention our line crews and other staff that interact with the public, the cloth masks, of course, prevent a person from spreading the virus more easily, but it provides only minimal protection to the person wearing the mask. And that's where the N95 masks come in, as they provide protection for our critical essential workers from safety issues at the plant and also from the public. So we do need more assistance in this area on the N95 mask. With regard to reopening, of course, all the things you've heard from everyone so far is 100% accurate, and we totally agree. When we're talking about our employees that interact with the public, whether it be in the lobby of a cooperative building where customers still, to this day, they still come in and pay their bills, in many cases in the lobbies, whether it's in the field or in homes or businesses, we have to make sure that our critical staff are provided the tools and equipment they need to remain healthy and not infected with the virus, so that we can keep the lights on in a reliable manner. So those are the main things I wanted to mention. And again, want to thank Elise, NGA, and our state and federal partners for all of their efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. I did have a couple of questions come in. The first one is on the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. I know the CARES Act allowed for additional or some of that funding to be used for LIHEAP. I wanted to know, are any of your utility organizations either promoting the program, since there may be people newly eligible that aren't really usually aware of that, making sure they're utilizing that, or is there any work going on to kind of advocate within states to try and get increased funding for your LIHEAP program?
So this is a place where all three electric trades and AGA are very active, asking for LIHEAP funding that matches the severity of this pandemic. So it's a constant push, but it's a very worthwhile cause. In fact, it is #1 cause right now for EEI.
And I would add, this is Lori Treweek, I would add that AGA also, as Laura has said, is actively pursuing LIHEAP funding so that customers have assistance in paying their bills.
And the same for NRECA. And if customers can pay part of their bill or all of their bill, all of that helps in many different ways, not only revenue stream to the cooperative or other utility, but also keeping other employees paid and on staff to do the critical jobs that they do.
And so this is Desmarie with APPA. Again, echoing everybody's comments, LIHEAP is a top priority for us. And we have members that are ensuring that their customers are aware of LIHEAP and finding ways to ensure that they know how to reach their community action center so that they can start the LIHEAP application process. So yes, it's very much important, and we do appreciate greatly what Congress has appropriated thus far for additional LIHEAP assistance.
Perfect. I think that's really helpful. I think it's a good program, especially with the increased funding available to try and help people make it through this pandemic. I also wanted to cycle back around, Barry. I know you said that this could be a challenging time financially for a lot of cooperatives. I know the Small Business Administration announced, I think today or yesterday, that electric cooperatives be eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. Do you think that's going to be helpful for your members, or do you think more needs to be done to try and help them be solvent moving forward?
We're very pleased with that change, or I guess guidance or interpretation. But that's not on its own going to be enough. I mean, we're looking at potentially, some of you may have seen in a press release that NRECA put out, we're seeking over $10 billion in assistance for the 930 co-ops in the United States. So it's going to take a lot to get our co-ops back to par, and but we are very pleased with that change.
That's very helpful. I'm going to do one last opening to any other questions from states before we bring this webinar to a close, or anybody who have remarks they want to talk about from what their state's doing and thinking about. You just push the raise your hand icon. I can give you the ability to speak. All right, seeing no additional questions, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. I think it was really helpful to try and talk about these issues, and also thank you to all of our panelists and speakers who were able to kind of let us know what the industry is doing to respond and how they're also thinking about reopening. I think this is an important conversation to be having, something that needs to be had sooner rather than later, so we appreciate you and you're taking out the time to come and speak with us, and that's all we have for today, so thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Elise. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.